One of the hardest things about giving a drash on Yom Kippur, on Kol Nidre evening, there are two things that are difficult about it. Well, actually, maybe there are many more. I don't know. I'm bad with numbers. Eric, remember the story about that drash? I just told Asaf the story about the drash that I gave some years ago. I think it was the 60th anniversary of the founding of the State of Israel. Or was it the 70th? Do you remember, Eric? Anyway, so I gave this drash. I tried to talk about the founding of the State of Israel, and 60 years later, compare it to where America was on the 60th anniversary of America's founding. And for the entire drash, which I droned on and on and on about, what was America like, in 1846 on the 60th anniversary of the founding of America? And I went through all of the terrible things going on and on and on. After the drash, Eric Rosenbaum, our past president who was here, came up to me and said, Rabbi, 1846 is not 60 years after the founding of America. And I showed him, I even had done the arithmetic on a piece of paper. I added 1776 plus 60, and I came up with 1846. And Eric, to his great and beautiful credit and to our relationship, Eric said to me, Rabbi, can I keep that piece of paper? So anyway, I'm not so good with numbers, but Eric is, and anyway, other things to say tonight. So one of the things that's very hard about giving a drash on Kol Nidre is a lot of you out there haven't heard my drashes for the last 6 weeks. And I've been giving a lot of high holiday drashes, and I gave a big drash on Rosh Hashanah. And what happens every year is some people are very disappointed that on this drash I don't talk about X, Y, or Z. So first of all, let me say, I dealt with Texas and abortion on Rosh Hashanah, okay? So if you want to hear about that, go back to the Rosh Hashanah drash. I talked about my commitment to Palestinians and their full and free, dignified rights to have a state of their own. I talked about that on Rosh Hashanah. I talked about Ruth Bader Ginsburg on Rosh Hashanah. I talked about some of those things. So let me just say, I can't say everything in one drash. And I know for some of you coming here, this might be the only time in the year you come to a service. So I need to get a lot in. There's a lot of pressure on me right now to get a lot in for those of you who are here for one time. And by the way, I'm not judgmental. I think if it works for you to come once a year to a service, that's exactly what you should be doing. It just puts a lot of pressure on me. So, be gentle with me, okay? The other thing that's hard is that it's Yom Kippur. So many of us have deep and profound questions on us, right? Some of us have spent the last 18 months especially lonely and isolated and feeling like there's too much open space in our lives. Some people's lives have gotten busier and more hectic, and there's no boundary between work and home and having children at home, and life has become more hectic, more difficult. All of us have had an experience of being unmoored to a certain degree, to being disconnected from everything we knew on some level, and honestly disconnected from one truth that many of us lived with that we now have to question. Although honestly, Yom Kippur comes around every year to tell us to question this, which is the assumption that we will get up tomorrow morning and the world will look as it looks tonight. That assumption about the way we live was upended for many of us by the events of 9/11 20 years ago, or the events of COVID-19, or the events in our own personal lives where we've had only our own personal forms of terror create an upheaval that made us feel completely disconnected or unmoored or insecure. So this time is a time of great questions, and we all have them of all different kinds, and where is meaning in our lives, and how do we make meaning out of a life in which maybe our careers are no longer the focus, or maybe our work is too much the focus. This year in Jewish life is a Shemitah year, which literally means the time in which we allow the land to lie fallow. Shemitah is a complicated concept in Judaism. It happens every 7 years, where we're told that the land has to lie fallow for a certain amount of time. But it's only land in Israel, and it's only land owned by Jews, which has created, how shall we say, a lot of Talmudic circles around that requirement. So you'll find in Israel, for instance, a lot of farms have moved this year to be hydroponic farming because they're exempt from the rules if the planting is not in the ground but above the ground. Or they sell the land to non-Jews for the year, and therefore it's okay to do. But if we leave aside the legalistic ways to avoid some of the legal requirements of Shemitah, it asks of us some very big questions. How do we create space in our life for things to happen because there is space in our life? Shemitah doesn't exist alone, of course. Shabbat itself comes every single week to say that to us. We understand that without space in our lives, creativity is very difficult to achieve. Without the ability to get a little bored or to lie a little fallow, it's very hard to be deeply creative. And we saw when I talked on Rosh Hashanah about the creation of the world itself, it comes out of a place of deep chaos, in fact, tohu vavohu. And we are all living in a time of great chaos. But the question is, how will we find the space to allow ourselves to be the kind of creative people we want to be? And by creative, I don't mean just traditional creativity, as in the arts, although I do mean that for sure. I mean to be creative about ourselves, to come up with new solutions that we hadn't yet imagined possible, to find things that will feed our souls that we hadn't considered before. When I talked on Rosh Hashanah about the Eitz HaDa'at Tov V'Ra, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, I talked about that moment that we as humanity all of a sudden understood evil exists in the world. What do you do next? It happens in our own lives, and for some of us it happens very early on at the hands of an abusive parent, perhaps, is how we learned there's evil in the world. Or maybe it happens with an abusive partner, or watching things at work go so badly wrong because of somebody's ill intent. There are so many ways that we as individuals learn about evil in our personal lives, or maybe it's somebody becomes president of the United States who is a sociopathic narcissist whose only interest in the world is his own power and his own wealth. And thousands and millions of people gather around him to not only support him, encourage him, but to create a movement that will last long after his term is up and we are faced with so much evil in the world. What happens next? Well, the story's pretty quick, and I hate to tell you all, but it's very fast. We get thrown out of the Garden of Eden because guess what? That's what life is. It isn't perfect. We're thrown out of paradise very early, very quickly. What happens immediately by chapter 4 in the book of Genesis, Cain and Hevel, the first murder, Cain and Abel. By chapter 4, we're already killing each other. By chapter 6, we're experiencing unrestrained hatred and violence, so much so that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says a flood must be brought to wipe out humanity. By chapter 11, we have the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel, where people can no longer understand each other. The divisions among nations and peoples are so intense that they cannot even speak a language understood by another person. There's chaos and division. And that's all by chapter 11 of the book of Genesis. Well, I think we in our time can see all of these things swirling around us at all times. We see murder and jealousy like Cain and Hevel. We see unrestrained hatred and violence that led to the Mabul, the flood. We see murder and chaos and division, misunderstanding, just like we saw with the Migdal Bavel, the Tower of Babel. I want to tell you something that I learned on my last sabbatical. I am grateful that in this Shemitah year, CBST is granting me a sabbatical, as it has several times over the course of my 30 years at CBST. And honestly, without those breaks, I wouldn't have made it 30 years. I mean, that's the very big truth, that Well, it's hard for me to leave, and it is, by the way. It's hard for me not to be doing this day in, day out. And it's hard for CBST maybe not to have me. For 6 months for my being away has, in my experience, created a fallow time within the synagogue where people have stepped forward, things have flourished. Things can happen if I'm not around. And the same thing is true for me and my spiritual growth. Some things can happen if the focus of every one of my days is not taking care of CBST, but taking care of me. And then I can come back to CBST with so much deeper and more interesting things to offer. Now, and I'm very happy that this year, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen has been hired by CBST on a part-time basis to serve as a part-time sabbatical replacement rabbi to make sure there's a little bit more rabbinic support, because exactly as Sabrina has said, we have grown tremendously, and the demands on the rabbinic staff are enormous. So I'm thrilled that Rabbi Ayelet Cohen will be joining the CBST staff in a part-time way. More about that later. But tonight I thought I would share some things I learned on my last sabbatical 14 years ago. During that sabbatical, I decided to take a painting class. I have always loved art, just like I've always loved music, but I cannot create music and I have never created art. So I decided I would do something way outside of my comfort zone, and I took not just a painting class, and some people who are watching today will deeply appreciate this. I'm thinking of you, Richard Orient, who's here tonight. I took an oil painting class as my first ever art class. That's kind of diving into the deep end for those who understand what oil painting is like. And I took it met 1 day a week for 5.5 hours each time. First of all, the first thing I learned is that there are more hours involved in preparing the canvas and the paints and then cleaning up afterwards than almost there's time to paint in a 5.5 hour session. Wow, that's an important thing to understand. How much time it takes to prepare a canvas, to prepare the paints, to even start to do something like paint. The thing that has stayed with me in such a deep way, and by the way, I still have a couple of the paintings I made then, and let's just say they're not going to get hung anywhere where anybody else will see them. But I learned a lot in trying to create art, which is, as I said, nothing that I've ever done in my life. We were told to read a book when we started the class, Joseph Alber's book called The Interaction of Color, which some of you who are artists I know are very familiar with. I have a copy of the book, my copy from that sabbatical, here with me tonight. What does Albers teach in that book and the years that he was a professor as well as an artist is that he taught about color itself. Now, before I took this class and before I went on this sabbatical, I never thought about color. That's an idea that, okay, I like that painting, I don't like that painting, that speaks to me, that doesn't speak to me. That color's nice, what's that color? But Albers teaches very deep truth about color that has stayed with me these 14 years and affects me as I think even about tshuva itself. Albers very famously teaches, and let me read from the book itself. He compares art to music, and this is something we know well. We often quote that the notes alone in music don't actually make music. We need those rests between the notes to really create music itself. Albers writes in his book, in musical compositions, so long as we hear merely single tones, we do not necessarily hear music. Hearing music depends on the recognition of the in-between of the tones, of their placing and of their spacing. And this is something I think Joyce and Adria and Sam can speak a lot about. I've listened to them practice. I listened to Joyce and Sam work very hard on phrasing and on spacing and on rhythm. It's way, way, way more complicated than the black notes on a page, it turns out. In writing, Albers continues, a knowledge of spelling has nothing to do with an understanding of poetry. Equally, a factual identification of colors within a given painting has nothing to do with a sensitive seeing, nor with an understanding of the color action within the painting itself. Our concern is the interaction of color, that is, seeing what happens between colors. We are able to hear a single tone, but we almost never see a single color unconnected and unrelated to other colors. Colors present themselves in a continuous flux, constantly related to changing neighbors and changing conditions. I want to show a plate that is super famous to those of you who are artists out there, and super famous to anybody who knows Albers' work. This plate, if you can see it, is very famous because Albers points out in his use of paper to study color, let's see, can I get it? The orange square there and the square there in the lower bottom is the exact same piece of paper, color from the exact same piece of paper. Everybody see that up there? Or you're seeing it on this, you can see it on the screen. So that's the exact, he used paper because one of the things he wanted to do was to eliminate the differences of pigment that would come from paint itself when he did these color studies that are in this book and elsewhere. So he wanted to show that you could look at those two different squares, but you see them differently based on the colors that surround them. Now, I know you artists out there know that, and it's obvious to those of you who work with color and paint, but I had never really thought about that before, that what surrounds the color creates the color itself. And of course, as Albers describes, if you asked 50 people what they see when they see the color we call red, 50 people will see a different color. That colors themselves resist a uniform response or even an understanding. Or think of the color blue. How many different things that we call blue are blue? So if the first thing that I learned in that art class was that you have to spend a lot of hours preparing a canvas if you don't just buy one from the store prepared, and then you have to prepare pigments and paints for a long time to get any color. The second thing I learned that has stayed with me deeply is that color is affected by the neighborhood it keeps more than what it is in itself. That how you place a piece of paper with color on it, and Albers has very famously many different studies in this to show how this works. So when you paint, you need not only to know the color you're putting on the canvas, but what are the colors that are going to touch it? How is it going to get affected? And in fact, in that oil painting class that I took, we were only ever allowed to paint with two colors, and we could use white, just so we could really explore how colors relate to each other. Every perception of color is an illusion, Albers says. We do not see color as they really are. In our perception, the colors alter one another. How do we build our lives to create the colors we want? So what is Yom Kippur? And how, after all, does this concept of colors affect my words tonight? I know I can't respond to everybody's pressing concern on your hearts and your souls tonight. Where are we in the world? The great lesbian poet Mary Oliver famous asked, "What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" We know in Yom Kippur that in some levels, the service, the day itself, is a dress rehearsal for our own deaths, that we wear the kittel, we dress in white, which is the color of death in Judaism, not to be morbid, but in fact to find the joy of living. How do we create a life in which that joy exists? So from my study of colors, and I'm a very, shall we say, beginner when it comes to the creation of art, but learning this question about the relationship of colors to their neighbors has helped me so deeply to appreciate art. But not only that, to give me a sense of what it is to make our lives a piece of art. Sometimes we have no control over the very central issue that's tormenting us, that's affecting our lives in deep and profound and sometimes horrific ways. We don't necessarily have control over political events outside in the world in which we live or internal demons that we're struggling with. But sometimes what we have to do is to change the colors that are on the outside of that central piece we're struggling with. The Dalai Lama once famously said, "Don't ask yourself what to do to make yourself happy. Don't talk about happiness as the goal. Ask yourself, what are the conditions you have to create in your life that will lead to happiness? Over that, we have some control. How do we create the foundations and the framework, the colors, as it were, that will affect that central color? We imagine what the central issue in our life to be immovable, immutable, completely unaffected. There's nothing in our power. But imagine that we can create the frame, the color that surrounds that piece that is immovable, immutable, completely intractable. And we pray for the ability to soften those edges with colors that will transform that central color, that will make it softer, that will help us understand that our job is to be a creator like God was the creator. Beauty itself comes from the chaos of tohu vavohu. And when we create the colors that surround that center, we can impact, we can affect, we can transform, and honestly, we can completely change that central color itself. Is everybody following me? Can I get a little, that's okay, we're all okay? It is a little weird not having total feedback here. So, Joseph Albers. His study in colors is, of course, so much deeper than that. How do we see things, whether or not we have sight? This is about how do we actually see things? How do we understand that our job is to be open to the universe, to soften the edges, to create frameworks of beauty so that even if it's ugly at the center, the framework itself will start to bleed and soften and transform the very center itself. Be strong. Have courage. Sometimes the framework we create are actually other human beings. Sometimes we're not capable of being those outside colors that will change the inside color. What are the conditions you need to create in your life to do what it is you want to do? To feel joy, to laugh, to be creative, to cut down on the amount of work you're doing, to cut down on the loneliness you're feeling, to transform your sense of compassion fatigue and a sense of being overwhelmed by the world in which you live. None of those have to be. But we all have to create the framework to transform ourselves into the person we want to be. God wants this of us. God cries for us. God is asking us to come home. The great gay black writer and activist James Baldwin, who spent most of his life in France trying to get away from the homophobia and the racism of America, was not primarily a poet, but he did write a poem to his sister that I read to you now, and will end my words with Sally Wilford singing these words as she sang them at our concert in June. Some days worry, some days glad, some days more than make you mad. Some days more than shine when you see what's coming on down the line. Some days you say, oh, not me, never. Some days you say, bless God forever. Some days you say, curse God and die. And the day comes when you wrestle with that lie. Some days tussle and some days groan, and some days don't even leave a bone. Some days you hassle all alone. I don't know, sister, what I'm saying, nor do no man if he don't be praying. I know that love is the only answer, and the tightrope lover the only dancer. And the lover comes off the rope today. The net which holds him is how we pray, and not to gods unknown, but sometimes to each other. The falling mortal is our brother. Some days leave, and some days grieve. Some days you almost don't believe. Some days believe you, some days don't. Some days believe you, and you won't. Some days worry, some days mad, some days more than make you glad. Some days more than shine. Witnesses coming on down the line. I pray that each of you creates the colors of your own frame, and that in this year, in this coming year, the hard places soften. The painful places become sweeter, and you experience God's presence in your life. Shana Tova.